The Dragon is a 10/10 dragon avatar for 4 of any color, then 1 each of white, blue, black, red, and green. He has flying. He has Eminence, which reads, as long as the Dragon is in the command zone or on the battlefield, other dragon spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. He also has an attack trigger, where whenever 1 or more of your dragons attack, you draw that many cards. You may then put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. Dragon Daddy is strong! Eminence is widely touted as being an overpowered broken mechanic, and the amount of value gotten from the attack trigger alone can make the Dragon the very first target at the table. Now, we've covered the Dragon once before, but that was 5 years ago. Since then, we've gotten a lot of newer cards, and we've gotten better at building strategies. This deck will focus on, not surprisingly, dragons. Dragons can be tremendous threats when dropped onto the table, and with the Dragon helping us cheat those mana costs, we can then fill our deck with Haymaker dragons that'll let us dominate the battlefield. Dragons are some of the largest and most powerful cards in the game, and we have all of them at our disposal with a 5-color commander. Now, let's start off with the dragons that we've got in our brood. Ancient Copper Dragon is a 6/5 for 4 and 2 red with flying. Most of the dragons have flying, so I might just start skipping over that part. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you roll a d20, and then you create treasure tokens equal to that result. This might be a bit risky, relying on the roll of the die to create treasures, but we're creating treasures. Any amount of these will help us ramp into our other dragons. See, dragons are very mana-intensive creatures. They're very hungry for mana. Almost all of our dragons cost over 5 mana, and so by leaning into treasure production, we can use them to extend into additional plays without being too taxing on our land base. Atarka Worldrender is a 6/4 with flying and trample for 5, a red, and a green. Whenever a dragon you control attacks, it gains double strike until the end of turn. This is a game ender of an ability. Dragons are generally very big creatures, and so giving them double strike means they are doing double damage. That aforementioned Copper Dragon can roll 2 d20s, netting us even more treasure. A lot of our dragons have abilities that will trigger when they connect to an opponent, so keep in mind with double strike, this will be doubling those triggers. Speaking of, here's Balefire Dragon, a 6/6 with flying for 5 and 2 red. Whenever he deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature that player controls. This is a board wipe of sorts, burning off any creatures that fail to defend their controller. It's an excellent threat to board states. Because it's got flying, it's a lot harder to block, so it's a lot more likely that that 6 damage will be connecting. And it's definitely the card to watch for when you're playing against this deck. Bladewing the Risen is a 4/4 zombie dragon for 3 generic, 2 black, and 2 red. It has flying. What a surprise. When he enters the battlefield, you may turn target dragon permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield. You can also pay a red and a black to give your dragons +1/+1 until the end of turn. This will introduce us to our secondary strategy of Reanimation. See, a lot of our dragons cost a lot of mana, and even with the numerous cost reduction spells we'll discuss later, it's a deck that takes a hot minute to get going. One solution to that is go the Reanimation route. We have ways of pitching the dragons to the graveyard, and obviously with how much of a threat these are, they will be the targets for removal. So, we have ways to get them back from the graveyard. This cheats the cost of casting them, and it'll help our strategy get the lead out. Dragonlord Jamoka is a 5/7 for 4, a green, and a white, with lifelink and flying. He can't be countered, and then your opponent can't cast spells during your turn while Jamoka is in play. This is one of the few defensive dragons. It's going to keep our board safe from interaction spells and counter spells while it's on our turn. It doesn't protect from activated abilities or the cards that are already in play, so keep that in mind. Goldspan Dragon is a 4/4 for 3 and 2 red with flying and haste. Whenever it attacks or becomes targeted by a spell, we create a treasure. It also has a static ability, letting treasures tap and sack for 2 mana of any one color. This gives our treasure double the power, playing further into our goal of using treasure to cast more dragons, and getting treasure on its attack trigger is going to make this an all-star ramp engine. Hellkite Charger is a 5/5 for 4 and 2 red. It has flying and haste, and whenever it attacks, you may pay 5 and 2 red to untap all attacking creatures, and then after this combat phase, you get an additional combat phase. There's your win con. Should we be able to produce 7 mana each combat, we can begin stringing together combat phases to just win through infinite combat. Combine this with a card like Old Gnawbones, a 7/7 for 5 and 2 green, who has the ability, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, create that many treasure tokens. There's all the ramp you could ever need. Just attack, make mana, win. If our attacks can generate at least 7 treasure tokens, and that's not just specific to Gnawbones and the Hellkite Charger, we can go off. So these are definitely going to be another pair of cards to watch for, and could even be something that if you're piloting the deck, you can start pushing for. Speaking of cards to look out for, Hellkite Tyrant is perhaps the most dangerous dragon in the entire deck. It costs 4 and 2 red for a 6/5 with flying and trample. Whenever it connects and deals combat damage to a player, we gain permanent control of all that player's artifacts. Then, at the beginning of that upkeep, if we control 20 or more artifacts, we win the game. Now, this does not specify whose artifacts that 20 needs to be comprised of, so as long as we have a collective 20, we win. Do keep in mind that when the artifact stealing ability goes onto the stack, that player can sacrifice their treasure tokens they control to prevent us from taking them before this resolves. Clouth Unrivaled Ancient is a 4/4 for 5, a red and a green, with flying and haste. Whenever he attacks, you add X mana in any combination of colors where X is the total power of attacking creatures. That mana can only be spent on casting spells, but you do not lose that mana as phases and steps end. This is a great extender that can let us play more spells on our second main phase, and given the sheer size of some of our dragons, that total power can convert into a huge swing of mana production. Morphon the Boundless is perhaps the weirdest looking dragon in the entire deck, some Gudra nonsense, as a 7/7 shapeshifter for 7 mana, but it has Changeling, therefore making it a dragon among a few other creature types. When it enters the battlefield, we choose a creature type, aka dragons. Dragon spells then cost 1 mana of each color less to cast, reducing the colored cost of our spells. This is invaluable as it makes our commander cost only 4 generic mana. This can get our deck rolling quite a few turns earlier. Scale Lord Reckoner is a 4/4 for 3 and 2 white, and whenever a dragon you control becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you destroy target non-land permanent that player controls. This is our main deterrent of removal, lest our opponents let us destroy a card on their field as revenge. Scion of the Ur-Dragon is a 4/4 for 1 each of white, blue, black, red, and green. You can pay 2 mana to pitch a dragon from your deck to the graveyard to have Scion become a copy of that card until the end of turn. This plays very nicely into our Reanimator strategy, as not only can Scion of the Ur-Dragon become any dragon in our deck at instant speed for 2 mana, but it also puts the original in the graveyard, setting up our graveyard for future plays. Tower of the Peaks is a 5/4 for 3 and 2 red. Spells your opponent cast that target the tower will cost an additional 3 life to cast. That has ward before ward was a thing. Whenever another creature enters our battlefield, Terror deals damage equal to that creature's power to any target. That's pretty intense, as most of our creatures are at least 5 power. This can add up quickly and start threatening life totals as we get more and more dragons coming into play. Now, you may have noticed by this point that most of our dragons cost a hefty bit of mana to cast. We have a number of cards in the deck to help mitigate that cost and cheapen our cost further. Our Commander's Eminence ability is one of them, being active from the command zone or while on the battlefield, but we've got a few others just to really start getting the game going. Birds of Paradise is here, as the best mana dork this deck would want. It's a 0/1 for 1 green mana that taps for 1 mana of any color. I chose not to use the clunky Mana Dorks Elf suite, as not all of our cards need green, and I think it's too many slots being taken up by elves. Bloom Tender is a 1/1 for 1 and 1 green. It taps for each color among permanents you control, adding 1 mana of that color to your mana pool. A lot of our better dragons are multicolored, and so this is going to scale nicely as we get more colors into play. If you have your commander in play, this taps for Wooburg. Dragonlord's Servant and Dragonspeaker Shaman are both here as classic dragon ramp spells. The Servant is a 1/3 for 1 and a red, and it reduces dragon spells by 1 mana. The Shaman is a 2/2 for 1 and 2 red, and it reduces dragon spells by 2 generic mana. Both are ideal for early game plays, as it will help reduce the cost of your further dragons. Essika, God of the Tree, is a 1/4 god with Vigilance for 1 and 2 green. You can tap it for any color, and it lets your other legendary creatures have Vigilance and also tap for any color. This turns every legendary dragon into a Birds of Paradise, making them very useful to ramp us into further plays. It also has a flip side that can be cast for Wooburg as the Prismatic Bridge. At the beginning of your upkeep, you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature or a planeswalker. Put the card onto the battlefield and the rest to the bottom of your library in a random order. This will be helping us churn out dragons, as you're always going to hit a creature and it's more than likely going to be a dragon. Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia, is a 2/3 Elf Druid Scout for 2 and a green. It can tap for 2 mana of any combination of colors that can only be used on creature spells or the abilities of creatures or creature spells. In addition, when you cast a creature spell with 5 power or greater, you could put a +1/+1 counter on Gwenna and untap Gwenna. This is one of the better mana dorks in the deck, letting you continue to extend as you start playing more of our bigger creatures. Both Ignoble and Noble Hierarch are here, both 1 green mana 0/1s with Exalted. Exalted gives a creature that's attacking solo +1/+1 until the end of turn. The Ignoble can tap for 1 of either red, black, or green, and then the Noble Hierarch can tap for 1 of either green, white, or blue mana. These are far more flexible and useful than the mana dorks that we could have run, and the Exalted trigger might come in handy sometimes. Rivaz of the Claw is a 3/3 Viashino Warlock for 1, a black and a red, with Menace. You can tap it for 2 mana of any combination of colors that can only be used to cast dragon creature spells. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a dragon creature spell from your graveyard. If you do cast a dragon from the graveyard, it gains, when this creature dies, exile it. This plays very smoothly into our Reanimator strategy, giving us the ability to cast our creatures from the graveyard each turn, and it's important to note that the exile clause will only pertain to if the dragon dies. If we blink or bounce it, the card does not get exiled. Sarkhan, Soul of Flame, is a 2/4 human shaman for 1, a blue and a red. Dragon spells cost 1 less to cast. Whenever a dragon enters the battlefield under our control, Sarkhan can become a copy of that creature, except its name is still Sarkhan, it's still legendary in addition to its other types. This is a really unique copy ability that I love in this deck, as it gives us a second instance of a dragon, and because it's retaining Sarkhan's name, the legendary rule does not apply. This can give us a lot of value should we get something like a second copy of Old Gnawbone. Sylvala, Heart of the Wild, is a 2/3 Elf Scout for 1 and 2 green. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, if its power is greater than each other creature currently in play, its controller may draw a card. You may also pay 1 green and tap Sylvala to make X mana in any combination of colors, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. This is perhaps one of the best mana dorks in the deck, as we can generate mana equal to our biggest creature's power. Hey Dragon, what's your power again? 10? Neat. 10 mana of any combination of colors. Not to mention that most of the time, our creatures we cast will have the greatest power, giving us way more use out of this than our opponents. It's also important to note that with this card, if you sequence several dragon spells in order from least power to greatest, you will get additional card draw triggers, so keep that in mind while piloting this deck. Fist of Suns is a 3 mana artifact, and it lets us pay Wooburg instead of the mana cost for our spells. This is a very simple ability, but it's so impactful in a deck with such high mana costs like this. Our commander can be cast with this in play and technically save us 4 generic mana. This can be especially more helpful in the event that we struggle to get our colors fixed, as some of our dragons might be a little hungry for several pips of the same color. Orb of Dragonkind is 1 and 1 red for an artifact. You can pay 1, tap it to add 2 mana of any color combination to cast dragon spells or use dragon abilities. You can also pay 1 red, tap and sacrifice the orb to look at the top 7 cards of your library for a dragon card and add it to your hand. The rest go to the bottom of your library. This is a lot of utility as it helps fix your colors and acts as a sort of universal signet for all of our dragons. We can also ditch it to dig for a dragon, should we need one, or if we want to prepare and set up for the Dragon to drop it in for free with his attack trigger. Lastly, Urza's Incubator is a 3 mana artifact that lets you make dragon spells cost 2 generic less to play. The goal of this deck's early game really is to just get as many of these cost reduction spells down to help mitigate some of the higher mana value spells that we will be building up in our mid to late game plays. Now, while not technically a dragon cost reduction spell, I did want to mention Dream Halls, a powerful enchantment for 3 and 2 blue. Instead of paying the casting cost for your spells, you can pitch a card from your hand that shares a color with the spell you want to cast. This feeds very nicely into our Reanimator strategy, as not only are we cheating the mana costs to play our spells, but that dragon we can always get back later on. Sneak Attack is also in here as a nice way to cheat in dragons for a quick attack, and then in the same vein as the Dream Halls, that dragon is headed to the graveyard at the end step, and then we can always use it later on. Now, let's discuss that reanimation package. We have a need to get our dragons back from the graveyard, and so we can set something up with Entomb, a 1 black mana to pitch any card from the graveyard to the library. Buried Alive does something similar, let us pay 2 and a black to pitch 3 creature cards. We can then bring them back with a number of methods. Reanimate is literally the easiest. It's a 1 mana sorcery that does what the name implies. Put target creature card from a graveyard into play under your control. You then lose life equal to its mana value. This can be used in conjunction with Entomb, giving us basically a 2 mana means to cheat any creature into play. Animate Dead is 1 and 1 black for an aura enchantment that enchants a creature in the graveyard. That creature comes into play and gets -1/-0. There's a lot of slightly confusing text on this card, but it basically brings the creature back and keeps it in play while Animate Dead is enchanting it. Should Animate Dead leave the battlefield, that creature is sacrificed. Patriarch's Bidding is 3 and 2 black for a sorcery that lets each player choose a creature type, and then each player can choose to reanimate all creatures of one of the types chosen to the battlefield. This can be a little bit confusing, but if you choose dragon, as we probably should in this deck, your opponent can also still choose to reanimate all their dragons from their graveyard since you chose that type. Lastly, and perhaps the most mana intensive card in the entire deck, is Eerie Ultimatum, which costs 2 white, 3 black, and 2 green for a sorcery. You return any number of differently named permanents from your graveyard to the battlefield. We're in Commander, so we're only ever running 1 of each kind of card, so we can basically return any and all permanents from the graveyard to the battlefield. All the creatures sacrificed to sneak attack, all the cards pitched to dream halls, everything comes back for one last spooky hurrah. The goal of this deck is to ramp in the early turns, getting on our cost reduction spells, and then beginning to drop in some dragons. Once we get the Ur Dragon into play, we can begin to really go off, cheating the mana costs and dropping in the really huge heavy hitters. Because of the amount of power that we get to play all at once, giving creatures double strike with Atarka, we will be hitting opponents like meteors. So while this deck is a bit slow to begin, once it gets going, it will be hard to stop. Our opponents will waste the removal spells on our cards, but because we're on a reanimator strategy, any and all of our value creatures can be brought back later on, so it's a lot harder to take care of them. But for now, that will wrap up our look at the Ur Dragon. When Commander Masters comes out, will you be building this? Did you build the deck like I did back when it was first released in the Commander 2017 set? Let's talk about the dragons down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. I appreciate you hanging out with me for a bit. If you did enjoy, likes and shares are always graciously welcome. YouTube claims that 95% of my audience is not subscribed, so if you are part of that 95%, consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you never miss another video. And as always, thank you for watching. I'll catch you all next time.